Toward noon, we could hear the battle approaching. A salvo from the Russian artillery made us run for the cellar we already knew, where we saw a fat soldier, a Großdeutschland veteran, dancing and singing as the earth and air shook with explosions. His companions paid no attention to him. "He's off his rocker," Hall said. "He was that way already when we got here," someone else explained. Pretty soon, we too paid no more attention to the fat lunatic who was trying to execute a French can-can. "He's too much," Halls muttered. But the madman went right on waving his arms. In the afternoon, 5 or 6 tanks went to meet the Russians, with several groups of grenadiers right behind them. In the distance, we could hear fighting, which seemed to go on for about an hour. Then we saw the grenadiers coming back, surrounded by a thick swarm of fleeing soldiers. The woods beyond the orchards were red with fire. Scattered shots were falling all around the gasping soldiers who were dragging their wounded comrades with them. We realized that in a short time we would again be on the front line. The battle was drawing continuously closer, with its rumbling explosions and loud bursts of sound, and we felt ourselves gripped once again by the essential, inescapable anguish of the front. The counterattacks of the regiments whose positions we had crossed had been swamped, like our tanks, by the irresistible Soviet flood, from whom the most enormous losses seemed immaterial. An endless stream of orders was pouring from our basement shelter. Officers were regrouping all the fugitives, forming emergency units, and lengthening the line of defense above the hamlet, where there must have been a command post under the authority of a superior officer. From time to time, a bullet fired at random obliged one or another of our groups to dive for the ground. But compared to what we had been through the day before, nothing seemed particularly alarming. Only in the distance, about a mile away, violent contact persisted between the last of our retreating troops and advanced Russian forces. The veteran nodded as he listened to the rush above and beyond us. Feld looked into the shelter. "What's a crowd like this doing in here?" "Interception Group 8, 5th Company, Feldwebel," shouted the veteran, gesturing at the 6 of us. "The rest invited themselves in a little while ago." "Okay," said the sergeant, "your group stay put, but everybody else out. There are still plenty of holes outside that need to be filled." The other man groaned and got up. "Feldwebel," said the veteran, "leave us a couple of extra men to help out, in case some of us are killed. We've got to be able to hold this place." "Okay, but," before he was able to point to anyone, the fat lunatic who had been dancing when we arrived proposed himself. "I was a machine gunner outside Moscow, Herr Feldwebel, and nobody criticized my performance." "You stay then, and that fellow over there, the rest come with me." So our group was enlarged by the fat man, whom we had nicknamed French Can-Can, and a thin, gloomy-looking character. "I beg your pardon," French Can-Can said to us. "I hope you'll forgive me for encumbering you with my voluminous presence. You must see that digging a foxhole big enough to take me would be an awful lot of work." He began to talk, enlarging on anything that came into his head. From time to time, an explosion made him fall silent, blinking his little pig eyes. But as soon as the danger was past, he would start talking again, more voluble than ever. "You can set your mind at ease about the hole we'll dig for you," said the veteran, without a smile. "A few stones on your beer sack, and that'll be it." A mess truck had arrived at the hamlet, and anyone who had the nerve to go out could get his mess tin filled. The simple fact that we were being supplied restored some of our confidence. We felt that we hadn't lost all contact with the outside world. However, our panic returned at nightfall. The fighting flared up again with renewed violence, and in short order the rest of the German troops were retreating from the Russians, who arrived before the last of the Lancer were able to get through. We could see them, coming from everywhere, outlined against the shattered orchards. They were running toward us, shouting, but the noise of our guns covered their voices. A horrible massacre had begun. In the cellar, filled with smoke from our 2 Spandaus, the air was almost unbreathable. The noise of the anti-tank gun, which must have been red hot, had enlarged and multiplied the cracks in the ceiling, whose plaster fell onto our helmets like rain. "Let's take turn firing," the veteran shouted to Hals. "Otherwise, the guns will melt." Lindbergh, whose face had turned the color of his tunic, stuffed some dirt into his ears so that he wouldn't hear any more. A 5th belt of cartridges was running through my torn hands into the red-hot machine, which the veteran kept on firing. One of the 2 machine guns in front of us had been knocked out by a grenade. The other was still firing, sweeping across the ranks of Soviet troops, who were piling up in a horrible bottleneck. In spite of their desperate efforts to break through, waves of howling men were dying under our mortar and machine gun fire. We had no idea what was happening beyond our range of vision. Directly in front of us, however, the enemy was taking a terrible beating. 2 or 3 fragments of shrapnel had come through the holes in the wall, but miraculously, no one had been hit. Then we heard a heavy rumbling sound, and 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers ducked their heads a little lower. In front of us, among the living and the dead, hundreds of flares lit the darkness. For a moment, we were terrified. Then someone shouted, "It's our artillery!" The Wehrmacht artillery had finally regrouped and was pouring down its deadly rain onto the enemy. In the darkness of our smoke-filled hole, our faces lit up with relief. "That's more like it," shouted Can-Can. "Look at the pounding those Ruskies are taking. That's how it ought to be. Bravo!" In front of us, we could see the earth flying into the air. Lindbergh, who seemed almost mad with excitement, was yelling "Sieg Heil" at the top of his lungs. Evidently, the Russians were no better at standing up to our guns than we had been to their waves of assault the day before. The German artillery lengthened its range and pursued the terrified Russians into the trees beyond the orchards. The victory cry of the Russians had been replaced by the death rattle of thousands of dying men, which filled the air with a horrible sound. We thought the hamlet had been saved. "Let's have a drink," the veteran said. "We really ought to celebrate. I haven't seen such slaughter the whole time I've been in Russia. We should be able to breathe a little easier now. You," he said to Lindbergh, pulling him from his corner, "go find us something instead of sitting there sniveling." It was easy to see that Lindbergh had gone mad. He was alternating laughing and crying uncontrollably. "Get going," said Hals, who was fed up with him. "Run and find us something to drink." He gave him a kick in the seat of his pants. Lindbergh went off, holding his head in his hands. "Where will I find anything?" he asked. "That's your worry." "At the radio truck. Those fellows usually have something hidden. Or anywhere else. Just don't come back with empty hands." Outside, other soldiers were celebrating the rout of so many Popovs. In our cellar, the level of gaiety rose too. Can-Can began to dance again, and we imitated him. Tears of joy and relief were streaming from our reddened eyes and running down our blackened faces. The veteran was singing and calling for drink, and we trusted him. He had saved us that morning, and if he was rejoicing, so could we. He knew how the Russians operated and had already done a lot of fighting. He told us we would have a lull, but he was wrong. The Russian units had grown enormously and were no longer the crippled divisions which had been shoved out of Poland by the Wehrmacht and on into Russia for hundreds of miles. Times had changed. Beyond the cellar, beyond the hamlet and its trenches, beyond the thousands of cadavers and the flaming woods, the Soviet mass was moving into action again, trampling on its own dead and on ours, more powerful than ever, with hundreds upon hundreds of guns wheel to wheel. Soon their cries of victory would drown out our laughter. We had become 5 pairs of terrified eyes, staring into the murky brilliance of the orchard, which was lit by thousands of dazzling, quick-burning fires. The German lines had already been attacked 3 times by Soviet troops, and 3 times had repulsed them with extraordinary effort and bravery. Between the assaults, the big Russian guns pounded our troops and our artillery, which kept on shelling the enemy as long as it could. For 5 hours already, our laughter had been stilled as Stalin's organs hammered at our positions, killing many of our defending troops. The rest were either killed or driven mad by bombs. A few, like our group, had been lucky enough to dig in solidly and went on firing haphazardly with what they had left. Our ceiling had finally caved in, and the hole in the roof acted like a chimney to let the smoke escape. The tall, thin boy with dysentery had taken Hals's place at the Spandau for a few moments. A bullet or fragment of shrapnel had grazed Hals's forehead just below the visor of his helmet, and he was lying down beside 3 dying men who had been brought into our shelter to spend their last moments in relative tranquility. Then Hals's gun jammed, and only the veteran was left firing. Stiffed with exhaustion, helped by Can-Can, the Sudeten, and me. We felt a crushing sense of despair when Russian rockets erected a wall of white fire over our mortar trench. The Geschnauts had been dismantled, and the anti-tank gunners had given up long since. Only a few Spandaus supported by light infantry guns prevented the howling mob from taking the village. We were threatened with being overrun or surrounded any minute. "I guess we'll have to die now," said the veteran. "Too bad for us, but I don't see any other solution." From time to time, in the light of the flares, we could see the nest of machine gunners in front of us, heroically fighting on. The Russians pressed their attack, ringing on their tanks as soon as it began to grow light, and death to anyone who remained upright. A shell destroyed what was left of our shelter and sent us all rolling along the floor. Our cries of distress were mingled with the screams of the tuned machine gunners, and then the shouts of revenge from the Russian tank crew as it drove over the hole, grinding the remains of the 2 gunners into that hateful soil. Hals stood for a moment, fascinated by the spectacle. He was the only one of us who had remained on his feet, and the only one who could see what was happening. He told us later that the treads worked over the hole for a long time, and that as they manipulated their machine, the Russian crew kept shouting, "Kaput! Soldat Germanski, kaput!" We managed to get out about 10 minutes before the Russians arrived. There was no longer any question in our minds. The rest of our forces had abandoned us. God knows how we managed to drag ourselves through the dead and the chaos and the lights of the flares. Our heads were filled with the sound of continuous explosions. It was impossible even to imagine silence. Hals was walking behind me, his hands red with blood from a wound in his neck. Lindbergh, who had finally fallen silent, was staggering just ahead of us. The veteran was a short way back, shouting imprecations against the war, our artillery, and the Russians. The fat lunatic was beside me, letting off an endless stream of incomprehensible muttering. As the noise of battle grew louder and the sky brighter, we forced ourselves into a run. "We're finished," Hall shouted. "We're not going to make it." I began to tremble and to cry with fright. My head hurt almost beyond bearing, aching with the noise of explosions. We kept falling, standing up again, and running on like automatons. Suddenly, Can-Can cried out. I turned my head to look at him through my exhausted eyes, and it seemed as if I were dreaming. I looked at him without feeling, as I moved one foot in front of the other, mechanically and with difficulty. "Don't let me fall," said Can-Can imploringly. His hands were clutching his belly, holding in something foul, like the offal on the floors of a slaughterhouse. "How could you go on like that?" I asked him, only half aware of what I was saying. Suddenly, he cried out again and doubled over onto himself. "Come on," said the Sudeten in a thick voice, like a drunkard's. "There's nothing we can do for him." We staggered on like sleepwalkers. We heard the sound of an engine behind us and turned to see what new danger might be threatening. A dark shape was jolting rapidly toward us, with all its lights extinguished. We summoned up what was left of our energy and tried to scatter. The half-track, which was almost on top of us, gleamed with dull reflections of the blazing explosions all around it. "Climb aboard, friends," shouted a kindly soul. We stumbled toward the vehicle, which turned out to be the one that had moved the Geshnauts into position above our cellar in the hamlet. 3 fellows who had been in the hamlet had managed to get it started. We pulled ourselves onto the narrow platform, which was almost totally occupied by the heavy, dismantled gun, and the engine started up again, carrying us across a heavily rutted piece of ground, which must have been the site of several gun emplacements. The soldiers standing beside piles of empty ammunition boxes waved to us as we passed, their faces drawn with exhaustion. "Clear out," our driver shouted to them. "Ivan is almost here." One of the artillery tractors was blazing brightly. Perhaps its flames dazzled our driver. In any case, we plunged nose first into a deep crater, and everyone was thrown out. I think I went through the windshield. I felt a stabbing pain in my shoulder, which was already sore, and found myself doubled over against one of the front wheels of the machine. "What are you doing to us?" someone shouted. "Shut up," shouted the driver. "I think I've broken my knee." I stood up, gripping my shoulder. My left arm seemed to be paralyzed. "Your face is covered with blood," said the Sudeten, looking at me. "Only my shoulder hurts, though." I saw Halls lying on the ground, already wounded. He had been thrown a considerable distance and was either unconscious or dead. I shook him and called him, and he lifted one of his hands to his neck. He wasn't dead. Somebody tried to drive our machine out of the hole, but its wheels only dug into the ground and spun helplessly. We walked on to the next artillery position, where the fellows were pulling up stakes. They loaded us onto trucks along with their gear, and we left in search of a quieter spot. In the distance, the horizon glowed red. "You've come from that inferno?" one of the artillerymen asked. He was talking to the veteran, who didn't answer because he had dropped into a deep, anesthetic sleep. Within a few minutes, almost everyone had done the same, despite the rough jolts of our progress. Only Halls and I remained half awake. My shoulder prevented me from moving and caused me great pain. Someone was leaning over me. My face was covered with blood. The shattered glass of the windshield had cut me in hundreds of places, so that I looked as if my blood were pouring from a deep wound. "This one must be dying," said the fellow, looking down at me. "I'm not," I shouted back.